Thank you very much, Marco. Again, a rich talk that has many themes that we can pick up in the discussion, and again, one which links into, in a variety of indirect ways, to the final speaker, Brother Herman Rosenfeld. One link being, you mentioned, Marco, the involvement of the CAW with the project of the Immigrant Workers Center in Montreal and what that relationship was like. And as many people in this room will know, Herman Rosenfeld is a long time associated with the CAW, both at the shop floor level and as staff. Currently retired from the CAW and is involved with the Socialist Project, particularly I think around the Labour Committee. No one has been an outspoken critic in recent years of the direction of the CAW. So it provides us one place to talk and return to these issues of the question of collective bargaining, concessions, the right to strike, and the direction of the kind of formal, organized trade union movement. So Herman will be our last speaker.
Thanks. The comments are I thought were very thoughtful, and I'm sort of thinking what you people said, so it's hard to get that out of my head. I don't want to just talk about the CAW because I think that there really is no fundamental difference between the kind of direction and problems that the CAW has moved in and most of the other unions, except that at one point in time the CAW wasn't that long ago played a different kind of role and stood for something else. But fundamentally, fundamentally, the challenges that the CAW are facing and the problems that they're facing aren't that different from other unions. And I think the reason why I just want to start with that is because there are intra-union debates and fights, and often on one level they're like fights between like in the middle of the night when the stray dogs are barking at each other. They're often I wouldn't say that. They're often very sectarian, and in particular, like all the efforts to say that because of some of the retrograde steps that the CAW leadership has made quite recently, which I think we'll all agree is the case, it doesn't mean that that the CAW is the font of all problems. A lot of that is coming from leaders and organizations which have the same kind of problems, and to blame it on another union is ridiculous, and to demonize another union is ridiculous. And I think that I'm not at the CLC this year, but because I have other things I have to do this week, unfortunately. But I hear a lot of that happening, and I don't think that's all that constructive. So let me just start with, just in general, that we're living in the shadow of unions and working people in general are living in the shadow of these economic forces. And I don't want to go too much into them, but in general, we know that it's sort of like in the late 1970s and 80s, we knew there were some fundamental changes that took place. Rather than outlining them, you know generally what they are. And we're sort of living in sort of like in the, if this is a movie, we're sort of living where the climax of these things are sort of having their effect. In a lot of ways, we hear about the loss of manufacturing jobs, and those that are being created, and some are being created, are increasingly non-union and located away from the traditional areas where the working people who are organized live. There's a tremendous restructuring taking place as a result of this intensified competition, which in turn is driven by this deregulation of markets. They're no longer regulated. There's a lot more countries and figures in it. And in steel, auto parts, and all of the goods-producing sectors, and even in the service sectors. Key sectors in Canada are downsized by the effect of international competition, and it threatens the future of unionized high-wage workers, even relatively high-wage workers that are unionized in service areas. There's a radical push right now in particular, to lower wages in key sectors. In the United States, the auto union has agreed to the long, sad story, maybe one of the last chapters of its life, agreed to that up to 20% of workers, let's say in Ford, are going to be paid half the wage that people that are working there now. Maybe they'll increase. That's the two-tier wages, but this percentage. And there was just a huge, very important strike, which lasted a number of months, led by some really wonderful people. At least locally, that American Axle, which is a major supplier, which used to be part of the big three, and they settled for this kind of a contract where people are going to be bought out, and if not, they have to stay at work and half the wages. It's a tremendous change in an undoing of what was gained 50 years ago in the key gains that the American working class made, and that's coming here. You see workplaces, all of them, industrial, private sector, public sector, all look like a mimicking a lean production model in one way or the other, either in its private sector model or in its functional equivalent in the public sector. The era where individual capitalists or employers were able to share the huge profits with workers is gone. This so-called neoliberal era forces competitive exports, and it makes it very difficult, and the space for the kinds of gains and relationships that unions had with particular employers in the so-called golden age are gone. There's huge divisions in the working class, huge stratifications, and it was referred to in different ways here. And those aren't just subjective divisions, they're objective divisions. Different sections of the working class actually have different lifestyles, have different kinds of jobs, and it's sort of like the water in a freshwater lake. You know, I learned this once when I was trying to learn fish for trout, right? That the levels of the bottom water, the top water, the middle water, they never mix except when they're just before freezing. It's almost like the working class looks like that. In the public sector, there's an increasing pressure to act like the private sector. Even in an era where we know there's a need for a massive infrastructural renewal, there's a big push to make sure that's private as much as possible with these so-called public-private partnerships. And there's a huge push to discipline, and it's been there a long, but it's really strong now, to discipline public sector workers, the public sector, and make it look like the private sector. And there's a growing acceptance, even in cities where there's progressive coalitions that are in power, like Toronto, at one time previously in Vancouver, Winnipeg, to accept, even where some of the leadership will support unions and oppose privatization, to accept that you've got to kiss ass of business to come in, and that's how it's going to grow, basically in the neoliberal model. So what this meant for the labor movement was a tremendous defeat. A tremendous defeat which comes in the 1980s and now, and we're still living in the shadow of that. There is some political defeat, and it's an economic defeat. And it severely limited the space for the kind of welfare state reforms people had before. It steadily reduces the possibilities for making gains from employers. And this balance that labor used to have between balancing out in the private sector, being competitive in markets, and also making gains, that balance is not there anymore. It's impossible to actually do both. And that's one of the things you see. And plus it destroyed the socialist left around the world. This has not just happened in Canada. So in fact, to have a pole of reference beyond the system, which in fact did influence, it's hard to believe, did influence a lot of labor activists at a point in time, is not there anymore. So what does that mean first in terms of, I speak mostly in terms of the private sector because that's the area that I worked in. Sam Gindy uses the terms deers in leadership of unions are often like deer in the headlights of neoliberalism. They don't know what to do because their old ways of doing things don't work anymore, and there's no left reference really to go beyond. So they make do. Number one, they accept the limits of neoliberal globalization, no matter how radical some pronouncements might be, like when Buzz Hargrove debated Ken Giorgetti a couple of years ago. Giorgetti said we should accept free trade. Buzz said no, they both accept it, because they don't really believe you can go beyond it. These folks have no sense that globalization can be challenged, that neoliberalism can be rolled back in any way, that mass movements are possible to build today that can make a difference ultimately. They live in an environment of resignation, that means they're resigned to it, of doomsday. You know, I hear all the time from people, the auto industry is finished. Why? Because the big three are challenged by other competitors. So therefore, they argue that this is the case. But it's basically a feeling, and it's all of the sectors that we hear the same thing, the steelworkers around the steel industry. And it fits with an already existing perspective of many rank and file workers having, as Iliam was describing, that is fed by the employers, the media, but also the reality they lived in. It's almost as if there's no alternative than to make our employers more competitive in international markets, in an era where that can't be done in a progressive way. And you can see how that closes off all kinds of political options that used to be like social democracy. So the role they often play is like the CAW is to modulate concessions and takeaways. They point to the U.S. and say they had two-tier, that was unacceptable, we'll do it in a different way. We'll mediate and moderate what they do, and hopefully we'll head it off. But it's hard to tell whether they really think they will ever head it off in the future. And so that's one of the ways that I read the recent Big Three agreements, in the sense that they are concessions, but they won't call them concessions. They're not the same as two-tier, but they're almost like Chapter 1. Once you accept the logic of doing this, then you see your role as essentially trading off wages, benefits, even working conditions for job promises. And job promises never come, but people already don't believe they can fight. It's plugging into this feeling that people have. And it also gives a sort of a militant cover to things. That brings me to some of the campaigns that they have. So these like there's a Manufacturing Matters campaign that a number of the unions are organizing now, and a lot of the activists are really good people who are working really hard on it. But a lot of that is just like a militant cover, because they're not really they don't really think they can challenge much, and the demands they make are like sort of ridiculous. And I'll get to what some of them might be. There is some militancy on certain kind of local things. The steelworkers organized, for example, a number of plant occupations to demand when places were closing, to demand wage close-off agreements and pensions and stuff, as the CAW did 10 years ago. There's a number of important fights against concessions in local auto parts plants, for example, in Windsor in the last few months. But those things are important. They matter a lot, but the fundamental direction you see of the unions isn't there. You have things like campaign schools in the CAW. You have your Palestine schools in the CUP, which you were able to get done. And then you have the outlier, the odd person out, is like the Labor Council in Toronto, which organized these incredible campaigns, like the minimum wage campaign. And I went to one of those meetings. It reminded me of the Days of Action, the feeling of participation. And the audience looked like this. It was a mixed audience. It wasn't just the usual grouping that you would have. Political campaigns in general, though, are tactically moderate and with demands that argue for space for employers and don't challenge neoliberalism, globalization, or, heaven forbid, the system itself. This manufacturing campaign often calls it for what they call fair trade. And if you look what they mean by fair trade, they basically argue that Asian markets should open up for Canadian goods. Right, which is ridiculous. You know, I mean, not necessarily ridiculous to have trade, but to argue that as the main point is absurd. And the reason why they do that, when you talk to them informally, is that they say, well, people won't agree if you say that we should limit imports from this place or challenge employers. And also, in unions like the CAW, it allows them not to antagonize the big three, because they're afraid that the big three is losing market share, is going to go out of business, that you don't want to do anything to antagonize them. So your strategy, in fact, is to help bolster them, right? And that is, if you think when a union starts having that strategy, what it will do, you know, what it has to say to members. That's the kind of thing that's sort of happening. Now, we're also in the public sector. There are big challenges as well. Like the back-to-work legislation happens a lot, and in Toronto now they're threatening it with they're threatening to use it with they've been threatening to do it with the transit workers. Where public sector unions practice business unionism, they get isolated and smashed. Where they link to different kind of visions of services and the user of those services, it's a lot easier. But the boundaries of what you can do and the kind of support you can get from the public are a little different than they were in the past. And so it often means you have to be much more radical in what you do and the kind of education, the kind of movement you do, which is one of the reasons why the BC hospital strike was ended as a failure. But there are other things which were not. In general, the politics of this period are also pretty awful. You have, on the one hand, some unions are still, in an anachronistic sense, I think, still looking to this progressive competitive vision through social democracy, through the NDP, which really can't go anywhere. But that was what they stood for. And since this space is no longer there, they have nothing to say, except for a handful of very radical people, good people who are members of that party, who we all know, like Peggy Nash, Libby Davies, those kinds of people, who are good people, who are odd liars out in that. But fundamentally, the union movement is stuck politically, because you've got to become more radical politically. You've got to start challenging the logic of capital, the logic of competitiveness, and they're not there. So being tied to the NDP, in fact, is one problem. Or you have what the CAW did. The CAW broke with the NDP from the left at one time, and then did a jump shift. And now in fact, not internally, but its leaders, and that's what its politics is essentially. When its top leaders, like Buzz, they basically go to the Liberals. That's where they look, because the Liberals are people who can give them resources to help the big three. And it's that kind of a political approach. Even though their official position of strategic voting, personally I don't have a big problem with that, because that's what lots of people do anyway. But that's not really what they do in general. There's the problem of organizing. and that there really is no massive organizing drive. You need a crusade to organize. If so many sectors of the working class are separated off from the trade union movement, you got to have a crusade. All of the things that people are saying, and it's not just like rah rah rah. It means you have to do things that are differently, and they're not doing them. They can't get the legal framework right. They can't agree how to fight in the legal framework. They don't want to collaborate because it's a question of who's going to get members. And you have things like Walmart, which are still sitting out there. You have the so-called transplants with the Japanese plants, but that's where the auto jobs are. And instead of saying the auto industry is gone, they should be organizing those people, and they're not. You need to have they're not doing the kind of campaigns you need to do that. And then you have some spectacular donors like the Magna. I didn't want to speak. You probably expected me to talk a lot about that. I'm not going to. This is where the CAW.
Once they're $10 back, just let us
know. This is where the CAW essentially made a deal. Made a deal that they'd be able to organize. They'd be able to have votes, uncontested votes in each of the Magna places. But number one, they wouldn't have the right to strike. But number two, they wouldn't have an independent union-based shop floor representation, steward system. It would be basically a variant of this paternalistic system of Magna, and they argued this. And then, of course, with the steelworkers, you had this joint effort to organize the FASCA, which really didn't work out either. If you can't, the other thing is that I think, as Iliam said, is you really can't. If you can't prove that a union would make a difference because you're giving concessions, or you're not fighting to challenge lean production in the workplace. You can't challenge the power of employers, which is a key component of why workers want to join the union in the first place. In places like auto retail and that sort of stuff, they will not join unions. There are other things. Their lack of leadership in building mass campaigns where there are none, like in the anti-war movement and fighting neoliberalism and free trade. And where there are mass movements, they either give them money and with strings, and Mike, that my brother was talking about some of the examples, or they stay away from them, and I don't. Well, you each described the different struggles. I have nothing to add to that. There is too much of the separation of unions between the rest of the class, and then finally there's the question of the lack of democracy. Most of it's not as and I won't even touch that because I can't finish that. But let's not kid ourselves. We're not dealing with a situation where this illusion that somehow the rank and file are chomping at the bit to fight. Most of the rank and file workers share this resignation, this fear. They're subject to an onslaught of doomsday rhetoric from the media, experts, employers, and union leaders. And that's what happened in the big three votes. They're not in themselves militant being held by leaders. But they share that. Why? In the era of neoliberalism, they're, without any reference point of collective struggle, they find ways to survive, like we all do. As working overtime, investing, speculating on housing where possible, believing that collective solutions are beyond the pale, they look for upward social mobility for their kids. Even people in the public sector, they oppose tax increases because they're worried about, even though it's a question of, they see themselves as taxpayers rather than what's going to pay for the service that they deliver and their jobs. And then there's hostility. Not only is the working class separated out, but there's hostility between the strata. I want to finish by looking at other alternative ways of looking. What are some of the forces which may help point the way? I think the most important one is what's lacking, and that is a need to have a movement which challenges the system. Not just one of a handful of tiny little groups, but one that's organically linked to the working class. There were those kinds of movements at different times in the 20th century. There needs to be one again. And there are small efforts in different places to do that. You need to have it. The current union movement was built in an environment where you had people who did that. In the 70s and the 60s with the public sector, and in the 30s and 40s with the private sector. There are activist strata of people who've been through a lot of the major, really critical struggles that we've been through in Ontario and BC and around the country. Those people are part of this, and some of those people are sitting here. Some of us are old white folks, some of us are old non-white folks. They're the activists of color and anti-imperialist activists, a lot who are represented here, which you don't usually see at these things, which is really marvelous. There are young people who, in fact, are looking for ways to build things. And then you have certain organizational nodes which don't fit the pattern, like the efforts in the Labour Council in Toronto, which did all these very interesting things. You have in the steelworkers, you have a Toronto committee, a district committee, which has done all kinds of interesting things. You have activists in here, Unite. You have in CUPW all kinds of activists. There's a CUPE Left. All kinds of different kinds of spaces where this can be helped to build. Finally, I just want to say the key thing to build, I think, if you can't eat a whale by one bite, you've got to eat it in little bites. You start off by the labor movement is not going to change simply by saying we're going to take over the CLC. Nobody's going to take over the CLC. It's by actually, or even the various affiliate members of the CLC, which we're all members of. It's actually trying to build movements inside your locals, and not just with people inside your locals, but trying to build a movement across, a movement that's beyond the union movement, but is close to it. Because obviously, not just the rest of the working class is outside of it, because that's how a left political organization will be built. And I just want to point out something here. It's called the Socialist Project Labor Movement Platform. It's a little thing we worked on as an effort to try and help contribute to building this. We have 50 copies of it here. Perhaps you can take a look at it.